Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to this first ever episode of Living Well. I'm sure glad that you've joined me this evening. This hopefully I'll catch on sooner or later. We're doing it here in the network so that people get familiar with our Fresh Hope Network and all that it has to offer. And so, really glad that you're here. I want to tell you right up front now, if you're watching tonight, on the app, you may not find the ability to chat this week. We're working on that and we'll have it fixed by next week, I'm sure. And if you're watching online on your computer, then you're going to see the ability to chat below. And my assistant Maria is going to be helping me catch on to who's chatting and what questions you might have. You can ask anything. It doesn't have to necessarily be on the topic for this evening, although tonight's topic is going to be very interesting, I think, for all of us, especially if you are in mental health recovery yourself. And so a couple of things. First of all, the program will be weekly. I plan to be here most weeks. And secondly, if you don't watch it live, if you can't make it at 7 Central on Thursday evenings, then you can always watch it on demand. And those of you who are facilitators, I want to encourage you to consider using this as a discussion video for your meetings. You can do that if you'd like. And there'll always be a series or a topic that I'm offering each week, and you can show the video in your group if you'd like. And like I said, you'll always be able to watch it on demand. I plan to go 20 to 30 minutes each week. And so we won't cover every topic comprehensively, usually in one episode. It'll take several, if not more. And tonight, we are going to talk about emotional intelligence, or some call it EQ, or emotional regulation. And so we'll get into that in just a few minutes. So feel free if you have any questions to ask, and just check in along the way, and be sure and let us know where you're watching from, and share the news with others. This isn't on Facebook, and you won't find it on YouTube. You'll only find it here, even though we're broadcasting on YouTube. You'll only find it here in the network. So it's a new adventure for all of us. Well, anyway, I couldn't have thought of a better example of emotional regulation, or the inability to have emotional regulation, than what happened at the Oscars this last Sunday night. I know. Everybody's probably tired of hearing about it or thinking about it. But this last Sunday evening, on the Academy Awards show, Will Smith slapped Chris Rock. And he got triggered by something that Chris Rock said, which was a joke, which was rather personal or whatever. And one could argue that comedians sometimes cross the line. Maybe he crossed the line, didn't cross the line. I don't know. That's really not for me to decide. But I can tell you this, that Will Smith sitting there got triggered in one way, shape, or the other. It seemed at first he was laughing at the joke, but then along I think he saw his wife's face, and it had to do with the fact that she has no hair, and she has that disease, alopecia, or some, I may be calling it the wrong thing. I don't have it written down in front of me. But anyway, he got triggered, and he just marched up to the stage, not far from where he was sitting, and he just open-handed slapped Chris Rock. He did not have emotional regulation at that point. He was not able to regulate his emotions. They got the best of him. Now, we all have this problem sometimes. Sometimes we all get angry, do things or say things we wish we wouldn't have. But hopefully, after we talk about this topic tonight, you'll see why it's really important to be working on this constantly in our lives. And hopefully, less and less will we get angry and sin. The Bible says, don't be angry and sin. In other words, in your anger, do not sin. Well, what's that mean? I think that means when you see somebody do something like happened with Will Smith and Chris Rock. Interestingly enough, Chris Rock did show that he had the ability to not respond in kind. He had emotional regulation at that point. He was able to regulate his behavior, and he didn't in return get triggered. So it's very interesting how that works, isn't it? So you have an example of both emotional regulation and lack of emotional regulation. So a couple of things. First of all, let's talk a little bit about what emotional regulation is, what emotional intelligence is, or maybe let's start by talking about what it is not. Okay. Um, what is low emotional intelligence? In other words, not high in emotional intelligence, but low. Low emotional intelligence refers to the inability to accurately perceive one's own emotions in both yourself and then as well as in others, and to use that information to guide your thinking and your actions. Um, Usually, what we believe deep seated down in our heart, something happens on the outside, and we have certain thinking with our head, but also our heart. And just that quickly, we react. And we react out of what we think at the moment, what we feel, and we could go from 0 to 180. And that's what I would call getting triggered by something. And if we have good EQ, good strong ability to regulate our own emotions and regulate them and understand what's going on inside of ourselves, we won't necessarily overreact or inappropriately react within those situations. And it's extremely important. In fact, I would venture to guess many of us who have mental health diagnoses really struggle even more so with our mental illness or our mental health disorder because of low EQ or low emotional intelligence. So it is good for us to work on and get as much EQ going for us as possible. Because, see, I think sometimes we've all grown up, if you've grown up with a mental, or if you have a mental health disorder and a mental health challenge, many times you've grown up being parented by somebody who has the same kind of thing or similar things. Or if you have a borderline personality disorder, for instance, we know in most cases you would have been raised in a very traumatic and had a lot of childhood trauma and abuse. And therefore, the emotional regulation tools that parents might have given or could have given were not given because the parents themselves didn't have them. And I'm not blaming parents or anything like that. I'm just saying that sometimes what we need, we didn't get, or what we needed, we didn't get at home and growing up. So, and I always say as a pastor, there are no perfect families, there are no perfect people. So it's just a matter of learning how to grow and to be headed the direction you need to go when life kicks you because you didn't get what you needed. Okay. So, and let me just say this before I really get into, I'm going to talk about 9 signs of low emotional intelligence tonight, or the lack of EQ. Um, but let me just say this. The really good news is that even if you have low EQ or low emotional intelligence or low emotional regulation, the good news is you can develop it. You can learn the tools, practice them, and gain more and more emotional regulation all the time. So that's the good news, right? And it's kind of one of those things where it doesn't take that long, but we have to focus on it. So, what are some signs of emotional intelligence or the lack thereof, or the lack of emotional regulation being very strong? So, I'm going to give you 9 things and kind of comment on a few of them, I suppose. But people who have this, they always have to be right. Uh, and I'm going to tell them myself, I used to always have to be right. And if I wasn't right and I knew I wasn't right, I at least would have to have you understand why I did what I did. And it was really because of uh, many times I didn't handle things well. I didn't react emotionally appropriately to something, and I'd get triggered and then I'd act up a little bit, and I might say something rude or get upset or whatever, and then I try to justify that behavior later. So if you're around somebody that's always got to be right, they may just have a little bit of a problem with emotional intelligence. Secondly, many times people who don't have a lot of EQ are oblivious to other people's feelings. In other words, they just say things, they kind of blurt them out and not even thinking about how other people might perceive them. Or even prior to saying something, maybe somebody's had a difficult day or whatever, and they're really not tuned into the other people around them. And so they just are kind of insensitive. They're insensitive to how other people are feeling, and it really kind of looks like it's all about them and how they feel. Um, Thirdly, they behave insensitively. In other words, they don't know the right thing to say, and so many times they just fail to say it, or what they say causes pain, and it's as though they don't have much empathy. Um, the fourth obvious thing would be that many times they blame other people for their problems. And now, who of us haven't done that every now and then? Um, but blaming people for their failures, you know, um, blaming the situation. I could have done better if I would have done. That wouldn't have happened if you. For instance, I've done hundreds, if not thousands, of hours of pastoral counseling with people. And through the years, I've had husbands say to me, well, if she wouldn't do this, then I wouldn't get mad, or I wouldn't treat her the way I treat her. And I always say, it doesn't matter. Even if she's wrong, you don't get to hit, you don't get to yell, you don't get to act out inappropriately. And, we always want to blame others. And, it would be so easy for Will Smith to say, if Chris Rock hadn't said what he said, I wouldn't have slapped him. I wouldn't have gotten triggered. Well, that's, Chris Rock, whether right or wrong, it happened, but how we choose to respond to things. It's not that we can't have a response. It's not that we don't have emotions and things hurt or whatever, but there's appropriate ways to deal with it and inappropriate ways. And the ability to react appropriately when triggered means that we have raised our IQ, that our IQ allows us to have those difficulties without even making things worse, if you will. So people with low emotional intelligence, you might say, just basically have poor coping skills anytime their emotions get triggered. They're not able to stay calm. They're not able to rationally use their rational mind. They kind of get into an emotional mindset. Some of you might be aware of this sort of thing because people have, you know, various personality issues or borderline personalities and other kinds of disorders have where they get triggered and they get into an emotional mindset. Well, that's low emotional intelligence. And many times people who have that have emotional outbursts. And you know, there's a lot of creative people, for instance, or people that are highly intelligent sometimes can have outbursts. And it's because their EQ, their IQ is way high, but their EQ is not where their IQ is. In fact, I read a book this summer in kind of preparing for this topic where the author talked about the fact that somebody can have a very, very high IQ and for all practical purposes be extremely able to do a job, for instance, and to uh, do things that other people absolutely cannot do. But they will have all kinds of troubles in the workplace if they don't have EQ. And they will come off arrogant and rude and all kinds of things if they don't have EQ. And that there can be highly, highly intelligent people who, by all practical purposes, should have just soared in the workplace and instead stumbled. And many times just didn't get as far as they could have gone because they had relationship issues in the workplace and they just didn't, their EQ was so low. And he said the reverse is true, that when people have maybe an average IQ or so IQ, but if they have good EQ, they can be very successful in life. Isn't that interesting? So, whether you have a mental health diagnosis or not, working on your EQ, on your emotional intelligence, is extremely important. In fact, I would say that the more I have been able to manage my emotional intelligence and become more intelligent emotionally and more able to regulate my emotions, really, quite honestly, the better my mental health is. Because your brain chemistry isn't being bogged down and messed up by all these emotions and that you can't regulate, that you can't deal with appropriately. And needless to say, people with low emotional intelligence struggle with relationships often. And they turn, usually conversations become about them. And even though they may not want it that way, but the conversations do become about them. Now, there's a show on TV. Well, there was. It's not on anymore here in the United States, and I don't know if it's in other areas of the country. And I realize we have groups all over the place, and in all different kinds of cultures. Japan and India being some of the countries here recently that have become part of the Fresh Oak family. Um, but let me just say this. Uh, there's a show called Mom, and it's about a mother and a daughter, and then the daughter has children, but it's about their relationship, and they're both recovering alcoholics and drug addicts, and it's hilarious because the mom always turns it in to being about her. Whoever wrote these program and created it really did understand shame and the whole cycle of all of this and how people act out emotionally. Well, the importance of emotional intelligence is really to become, you know, able to react and understand emotions of other people and the emotional dynamics that are going on in situations, and when we get triggered, to be able to regulate them. So emotional, you could call it emotional regulation, emotional intelligence. How about emotional self-awareness? And emotional self-awareness recognizes what motivates us, and in turn what brings us fulfillment. And it allows us, the emotional regulation allows us to regulate ourselves, but also to figure out what motivates us and how to have empathy for other people and how to have social skills, and also to not have our emotions rule over us. And when you have a mental health challenge to begin with, many people struggle with low EQ who have depression, who have personality disorders, who have bipolar disorder. I was doing some research earlier this week on this, and it's amazing how many studies there are. And people who have encounters with the law tend to have very low EQ. And but the good news is that it's possible to up your EQ and to develop your EQ and to do it rather, I would say, it doesn't take forever. And, you know, the first thing I've learned about myself in all of this is the minute I feel defensive, it means I'm having an EQ moment or I'm having a low emotional intelligent moment. And I need to hold my tongue and just listen and make sure that I'm understanding what's being said and not reacting to it and not letting the emotions be on top of all that, because then I don't hear as well, I don't understand as well. So I could tell you, just practically speaking, if nothing else, simply understand that when you get triggered, you physically have things that happen. Many times, if I get real triggered emotionally, I will get a dry mouth immediately. I got to have water, or I can barely swallow. I'm so dry. Well, that's one of the clues. And usually, if that happens, it means that I'm a little farther into getting triggered than the initial triggering. And it means that I need to back off, breathe, and listen. But you know what? That may sound difficult to do, but when you think about that prior to needing it, when you talk about that prior to needing to do it, um, it be almost becomes a new default setting for you. And how about any questions? Do any of you have any questions that you'd like to ask? Just type them in there in the chat box, and I'd be happy to entertain. Part of why we're doing this live is so that you and I can talk with one another. Many times what happens is when I do podcasts, we don't have the ability to do a call-in program. And by the way, if you haven't listened to our podcast lately, be sure and listen to these next ones coming out. There are some really, really good topics that are coming out, and one that you're going to be very surprised by. And he is an announcer and television and radio announcer for one of the major ball leagues here in the United States. So anyway, well, I'm not seeing any questions. I'm not getting any questions. Maria, do we have any questions from anybody? Um, We don't see any comments. Don't be afraid to write something. This is a closed environment. Other people aren't going to see the comments, and you certainly can ask them. Now, I want to tell you, if you by chance have a topic that you'd like us to talk about in the future, or if you by chance have questions that you'd like to ask, email me at pastorbrad@freshhope.us. pastorbrad@freshhope.us. By the way, we've got some interesting things starting with Fresh Hope. We've got a new thing that we're doing for pastors that we're almost ready to introduce to the world, and it's called Healing the Heart Wounds of Ministry. It's to help pastors and their spouses work through the hurts that happen many times in ministry. Secondly, we are also beginning to formulate, or we're going to be introducing soon Refocusing Widows, which is for, of course, widows who are going through the tail end of the grieving process and trying to figure out how to, get focused. And so anyway, those are a couple of things. How Penny asked a very important question: how to handle anger from a 31-year-old son. Boy, when you're on the receiving of anger and a lot of those things, what I would say there is one has to develop some real coping skills, that when the anger is coming at you, to regulate your own emotions, because it can so easily be that when one person shouts and says a bunch of stuff, another person shouts and says a whole bunch of stuff, and then it just gets to be this throwing anger around. I would say that one of the tools that can come in real handy at that point is simply breathing, and even to see if you can just understand what they're saying. And if somebody's yelling and really angry, but you react calmly, it will calm them down. Now, maybe not right away. Now, never stand there and let somebody hurt you physically. If that's the issue, then you have to protect yourself and get out of the situation. But if it's just that they're really angry or agitated, the other thing is many times it isn't a personal issue. Many times they think they're mad. I had a woman one time who got so angry at me that and it was just she and I in my office. My door was closed. The staff was around, but she got really mad at me about something. And it was that I didn't know her daughter was in the hospital. I didn't see her daughter. And she was livid. And she took her stiletto shoe off in my office. She took her stiletto heel and started beating the corner of my wooden desk. And I mean, I was just like, whoa. And she got up and she took one of my big theological books off the shelf and threw it at me. I mean, I ducked out of the way and I just kind of let her explode. And one of my staff members knocked at the door and was like, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm okay so far." She actually chipped the wood off my desk. And I said, "You're really not mad at me. You're mad at God about the situation, aren't you?" And that's all it took. And she started to weep. So sometimes if you and I can keep ourselves safe, but at least let the person, if they're going to explode or whatever, but to respond in a totally different way, very with empathy, with understanding, it changes them rather quickly. Now, not if they get wrapped up in their emotional mind. Let's say, I don't know, Penny, if your son possibly has any kind of borderline personality or personality disorder or things such as this. Many times, what people do is they get stuck in their emotional mind. And if they're in their emotional mind, it won't do any good to try to rationalize or anything. Then you just kind of basically have to say, let's talk about this when you're able to talk about it. And I love you. I'm not going to stop loving you, but right now we can't, talk about it. Um, Personality disorders can be very difficult in regards to this. And we could talk about this, but some very good therapy for people who have personality disorders is to understand the emotional mindset, the rational mindset, and how to use and switch from one to the other. Um, but let me tell you, they've got to work hard at it and really want to have better relationships. But, there's a fine line between being verbally abused over and over and over, which I'm not sure that's any better. And it's just as awful as any other kind of abuse. But there's also sometimes, as a parent, we are the only people that our fuse is longer, we desperately want to reach our kids. And so if you're able to regulate your own emotions and not get triggered by it, that would be the biggest way to probably help him. But if that personality disorder is real, and ultimately sometimes we have to let our loved ones feel enough pain that they want to get better instead of stay sick. I tell the guys at our county jail where I teach every week, I talk about the fact that many times those of us who have issues, we don't change until the pain of staying sick is greater than the pain of getting better. And I wish I was one of those people who heard something and then changed because I heard it. For me, I tend to not change until, it's painful to stay the way I am. And then I have to change. So I usually learn the hard way, but so does about 90% of the American population, at least. And I think that's probably true worldwide. So, Penny, I don't know if that answered or maybe kind of addressed your question, but email me and let's talk. Let's talk. Well, my friends, this has been the first episode of Living Well. Every week, we're going to talk about what do we need to do in order to live mentally well, emotionally well, spiritually well. By the way, those three things always get divided up in Western culture, and they're not, we're whole beings. All those three things mix and melt within us. And so it's so important because I want to be as emotionally healthy, mentally healthy, and spiritually healthy as possible. And so, my friend, until the next time that we gather next Thursday evening, same time, same place. And until that time, may the Lord hold you in his hope. In Jesus' name, we'll see you next week. God bless. I give me 1 second. All right.